It stretches across mountains, deserts, and centuries. But before it became a wonder of the world, the Great Wall of China was sweat, stone, and silent struggle. Tonight, we walk slowly along its ancient path, uncovering how millions of hands built what many never lived to see finished. From the first shovelful of earth to the final stone. This is the quiet, exhausting, and astonishing story of how the Great Wall truly came to be. If slow, softly spoken tales of ancient effort help ease your mind, you're in the right place. Subscribe now and tap the bell icon to drift along forgotten roads. One peaceful story at a time. Before we continue, I'd love to know where are you listening from and what time is it for you right now. It's always amazing to see how far our quiet little stories are reaching. You find yourself standing in the misty valleys of ancient China, around 450 BC, watching as thousands of workers slowly, methodically pile earth into wooden frames. The sound is rhythmic, almost hypnotic. The dull thud of wooden rammers compacting soil, layer by careful layer. This is where it all began, not with grand imperial vision, but with the mundane necessity of one kingdom trying to keep another kingdom from stealing their crops, the Kingdom of Qi. Nestled in what we now call northeast China, it's grown tired of raids from its neighbor, Lu. It wasn't a matter of great strategic warfare or a military genius. It was simply that the people of Lu kept crossing into Qi territory, taking grain from their fields, stealing livestock, and generally making life difficult for farmers who just wanted to tend their crops in peace. So the rulers of Qi made a decision that would echo through history. Though they had no way of knowing it at the time, they would build a wall tells us that this early wall, dating to about 450 BC, was one of the first recorded state walls in China. But imagine what this actually meant for the people doing the work. Picture thousands of farmers conscripted from their fields during the slower agricultural seasons, trudging to construction sites with their simple tools, wooden shovels, wicker baskets, carrying poles worn smooth by countless hands. The construction process was painstakingly slow and utterly exhausting. Workers would begin by marking the wall's route with wooden stakes, following natural ridgelines where possible to take advantage of the terrain. Then came the real work, gathering materials. Teams of workers would fan out across the countryside, filling baskets with the particular type of earth that worked best for wall construction, loess soil, which was abundant in northern China and had the peculiar property of becoming extremely hard when compacted properly. The actual building technique was called rammed earth or tamped earth, and it required a level of patience and repetitive labor that would test anyone's endurance. Workers would erect temporary wooden frames, creating molds that looked like long rectangular boxes without tops or bottoms. These frames were typically made from whatever timber was available locally, pine in some areas, bamboo in others. Sometimes just rough-hewn oak planks held together with rope and wooden pegs. Between these parallel wooden walls, workers would dump basketfuls of the carefully selected soil, spreading it evenly to create a layer about 7 to 10 centimeters thick. Then came the tamping, the endless, rhythmic pounding with wooden rammers that looked like long-handled mallets with broad, flat heads. Each layer had to be compressed until it was as hard as stone, a process that required workers to pound the same section of earth hundreds of times. The sound of this work would have carried for miles across the countryside, the steady rhythm of dozens of workers with their rammers, creating a percussion that marked the progress of construction from dawn to dusk. When one layer was completed to satisfaction, another layer of soil would be spread on top, and the process would begin again. Layer by layer, week by week, the wall would slowly rise from the earth. Working conditions were harsh by any standard. The construction sites were often located in remote, mountainous terrain where the wall could take advantage of natural defensive positions. Workers had to carry all their supplies, food, water, tools, materials to these isolated locations. often hiking for hours each day just to reach the worksite. During winter months, the work continued despite freezing temperatures, as the urgency of completing defensive positions before the next potential conflict drove the project forward. The workers themselves came from all levels of society, though the burden fell heaviest on the common people. Explains that the labor force included soldiers, who provided security and some skilled labor, but the majority were ordinary farmers and craftspeople conscripted through what was essentially a draft system. Villages would be required to provide a certain number of workers for a certain period, disrupting agricultural life and family routines. But here's what makes this early period fascinating in its mundane details. Each state developed its own methods, its own standards, its own approaches to the fundamental problem of keeping enemies out. The Kingdom of Qi built their wall one way, but when other states began copying the idea over the following century, they each adapted the technique to their local conditions and materials. In areas where stone was plentiful, workers would build 2 parallel stone walls and fill the space between them with rubble and earth, creating a composite structure that was incredibly strong but required different skills and tools. Where timber was abundant, wooden frameworks became more elaborate, sometimes resembling the frame construction used in buildings, with the earth filling serving almost like primitive concrete. The working day typically began before dawn, when the air was cool and workers could accomplish more before the heat became unbearable. Teams would be organized according to different tasks. Some workers specialized in gathering and preparing materials, others in building and maintaining the wooden frames, still others in the actual tamping work that required significant physical strength and endurance. Food was a constant concern at these remote construction sites. Workers had to be fed, and feeding hundreds or thousands of people in locations far from established agricultural areas presented significant logistical challenges. Simple meals of grain porridge, dried vegetables, and occasionally preserved meat became the standard fare. Water had to be located and secured, sometimes requiring the digging of wells or the construction of channels to bring water from distant sources. The social impact of these early wall-building projects was enormous, though it went largely unrecorded in official histories. Entire communities were disrupted as men were taken away from farming and craft work for months at a time. Women had to manage households and agricultural work without their husbands and sons. Children grew up with fathers who were absent for large portions of each year, creating social patterns that would persist for generations. What's particularly striking about this early period is how ordinary it all seemed to the people involved. There was no grand vision of creating one of the world's greatest architectural achievements. These were practical people solving practical problems with the tools and techniques available to them. The workers who spent their days pounding earth into wooden frames had no idea they were beginning a construction project that would continue for more than 2 millennia. Yet the techniques they developed through trial and error, the methods for selecting and preparing soil, the designs for wooden frames, the organizational systems for managing large work crews in remote locations, would become the foundation for much larger projects to come. Every innovation born from necessity, every technique refined through repetition, every organizational solution developed to solve immediate problems would eventually contribute to projects of almost unimaginable scale. As you watch these early workers in your mind's eye, methodically building their modest defensive walls, you might wonder what drove them to such extraordinary effort for what seemed like such ordinary purposes. How did the mundane task of keeping neighboring kingdoms from stealing crops eventually transform into one of humanity's most ambitious engineering projects? The idea of building walls for protection didn't remain confined to the Kingdom of Qi. For long, like most practical innovations, it spread as other rulers witnessed its effectiveness and began adapting it to their own needs. But the spread of wall building across ancient China wasn't a coordinated effort or part of some grand strategic planet was more like a slow contagion of anxiety, as each state that built a wall inadvertently encouraged its neighbors to build walls of their own. Reveals that by the 7th century BC, a Chu state had constructed a wall stretching 310 miles. By the 6th century BC, the Qi state had extended their original wall to 398.5 miles. The Qin state built walls in 461 BC and again in 409 BC. Then, another in 272 BC, the Wei state constructed both western and southern wall lines between 361 and 352 BC. The pattern was unmistakable once one state demonstrated the defensive value of walls. Neighboring states felt compelled to build their own. But here's where the story becomes fascinating in its tedious complexity. Each state developed not just different construction techniques, but entirely different philosophies about what a defensive wall should accomplish. The workers building these various walls found themselves adapting to wildly different engineering challenges and construction requirements, often without understanding the broader strategic thinking that drove their labor. The Chu state, for instance, built their 310-mile wall primarily to defend against raids from nomadic tribes to the north. Their workers faced the challenge of constructing fortifications across terrain that varied from flat river plains to steep mountain ridges. In the flat areas, they used the standard rammed earth technique, but had to dig deeper foundations to prevent the wall from being undermined by floodwaters during the region's intense rainy seasons. The process of digging these foundations was backbreaking work that rarely makes it into the historical records, but it was essential to the wall's success. Teams of workers with nothing but wooden shovels and wicker baskets would spend weeks excavating trenches several feet deep and equally wide along the planned route of the wall. The excavated earth couldn't be wasted. It would later become part of the wall itself, so it had to be carefully piled alongside the construction route and covered with woven mats to prevent it from being scattered by wind or washed away by rain. In mountainous areas, the Chu workers faced entirely different challenges. Rocky terrain made traditional rammed earth construction impractical, so they developed techniques for building walls that incorporated natural stone formations. Workers would spend days breaking stones to appropriate sizes using nothing but hammers and wedges, creating piles of building stones that had to be sorted by size and shape for different parts of the wall's construction. The Qi state, meanwhile, extended their original wall to nearly 400 miles. But their workers had to deal with a different set of environmental challenges. Much of their territory was subject to harsh winter conditions, which meant that construction work had to be carefully timed to avoid the worst weather. But also that the finished wall had to be designed to withstand freeze-thaw cycles that could crack and destroy inferior construction. Qi workers developed techniques for winter construction that involved heating stones in large fires before incorporating them into the wall structure. This required the establishment of semi-permanent camps at construction sites, complete with facilities for maintaining fires throughout the construction season. Workers would spend hours each day gathering firewood, maintaining fires, and heating stones to the proper temperature before the actual wall construction could begin. The organizational challenges of these extended wall projects were staggering. A 400-mile wall required coordination among hundreds of separate work crews, each responsible for a few miles of construction. Materials had to be transported across vast distances, often through terrain that had no established roads. Communication between work crews was limited to messengers on foot or horseback, making it difficult to coordinate construction standards or share innovations in technique. Each work crew developed its own solutions to local problems, creating walls that were functionally similar but varied dramatically in their details. Some crews developed better techniques for mixing mortars, using local clay deposits that provided superior binding. Others innovated in the construction of drainage systems, recognizing that water damage was one of the primary threats to wall. Integrity over time, the Wei state's walls present perhaps the most interesting example of adaptive engineering. Wei faced threats from multiple directions and built both western and southern defensive lines, requiring their workers to master construction techniques suitable for entirely different types of terrain and tactical situations. The Western Wall was built primarily to defend against nomadic raiders and followed traditional design principles: high, thick, and imposing, designed to make direct assault impractical. The Southern Wall, however, was built to defend against other Chinese states with more sophisticated military capabilities. Wei workers had to incorporate features that hadn't been necessary in earlier wall construction: regularly spaced watchtowers for observation, gates with complex defensive mechanisms, and specialized chambers for storing weapons and supplies. Building these watchtowers required skills that most wall workers didn't possess when they began the project: stone cutting and fitting, timber framing, and basic masonry all had to be learned through trial and error by workers whose primary experience was in agricultural labor. The towers had to be tall enough to provide good visibility, but stable enough to withstand both enemy attacks and natural weathering. Each tower required weeks of work by specialized crews and represented a significant investment of resources and expertise. The gate construction was even more complex. These weren't simple openings in the wall, but sophisticated defensive installations designed to allow friendly passage while blocking enemy access. Workers had to learn to cut and fit massive stone blocks for gate foundations, construct wooden mechanisms for operating heavy gates, and build guardhouses that could shelter soldiers while providing clear fields of fire against attackers. Perhaps most tellingly, records from this period begin to mention something that would become a constant theme in Great Wall construction throughout Chinese history. The extraordinary human cost of these projects notes that even in these early periods, the scale of labor required was enormous. The 400-mile Qi Wall, the 310-mile Sichu Wall, the multiple Wei walls each represented years of work by thousands of people. The social disruption caused by these projects was becoming more severe as walls grew longer and more complex. Entire regions would be stripped of their male workforce for months at a time. Agricultural production suffered as farmers were conscripted for construction work. Families were separated, and local economies were distorted by the massive reallocation of labor from productive agricultural work to military construction. But the individual workers, pounding earth between wooden frames, cutting stones with primitive tools, or hauling materials across rough terrain, had little understanding of these broader social and economic impacts. Their world was defined by the immediate physical challenges of their work, the weight of the earth they carried, the strain of the rammer in their hands, the ache in their backs after days of bending over construction tasks. Yet it was precisely this focus on immediate practical problems that drove the continuous innovation that would eventually make much larger wall projects possible. Workers who discovered that adding certain types of clay to their earth mixture made stronger walls shared this knowledge with neighboring work crews. Crews that developed better techniques for building on steep slopes taught these methods to workers facing similar challenges elsewhere. The accumulation of this practical knowledge, passed from worker to worker and crew to crew, created a growing body of expertise in wall construction that transcended the boundaries between states. By the end of the Warring States period, there were thousands of workers throughout China who possessed specialized knowledge of large-scale defensive construction, knowledge that would prove invaluable when a later ruler decided to connect these scattered walls into a single, unified system. But that transformation was still in the future. For now, these were still separate projects, built by separate states for separate purposes, using techniques that varied from region to region and crew to crew. The great unification that would create the Great Wall as we think of it today remained unimaginable to the workers who were unknowingly preparing the way for it through their daily labor and incremental innovations. By the 3rd century BC, the Chinese landscape was scarred with defensive walls in a way that would have been unimaginable just a few centuries earlier. The Zhou state had built walls totaling 528 miles across 2 separate construction projects. The Yan state had created 155 miles of northern defenses, with additional wall sections of unknown length protecting other borders. The accumulated wall construction across all the warring states exceeded 2,000 miles of fortification, representing what was probably the largest construction effort in human history up to that point. But what's remarkable about this achievement is how ordinary it had become. Wall construction was no longer an extraordinary response to unusual military pressures, was simply what states did to protect themselves. The techniques had been refined through generations of practical experience. The organizational systems had been developed to handle large-scale construction projects efficiently. Most importantly, there now existed throughout China a large population of workers who possessed the specialized knowledge necessary to build walls quickly and effectively. This knowledge was incredibly detailed and practical. Workers knew how to identify the best types of soil for rammed earth construction by examining its color, texture, and the way it held together when squeezed in the hand. They could predict how different soil types would perform in various weather conditions and which mixtures would provide the best long-term durability. Masterworkers could estimate how much material would be needed for a given section of wall just by walking the terrain and noting the local conditions. The tool-making had evolved as well. The simple wooden rammers of earlier periods had been replaced by more sophisticated implements designed specifically for wall construction. Describes how rammers were now fitted with iron heads that provided better compression and lasted longer under the constant pounding. Baskets had been redesigned with shapes and sizes optimized for carrying different types of materials. Wooden frames had become standardized, with sections that could be disassembled, transported, and reconstructed at new work sites. The organizational systems had become equally sophisticated. Large wall projects now employed hierarchical management structures with specialized roles for different types of workers. Master builders supervised overall construction and made decisions about routes and techniques. Team leaders managed groups of 20 to 30 workers and were responsible for maintaining construction standards and work pace. Specialists handled particular aspects of construction: stone cutting, timber preparation, mortar mixing, while general laborers provided the massive amounts of basic manual labor that wall construction required. Supply systems had been developed to support construction crews in remote locations for extended periods. Mobile workshops could produce tools and repair equipment without requiring transportation back to permanent settlements. Portable kitchens could feed hundreds of workers efficiently. Medical personnel could provide basic treatment for the injuries that were inevitable in large construction projects involving heavy materials and dangerous working conditions. But perhaps most importantly, the construction sites had become training grounds where knowledge was systematically passed from experienced workers to new recruits. Young men conscripted for wall construction weren't simply handed tools and told to start digging. They were taught specific techniques by workers who had spent years perfecting their skills. This knowledge transfer was informal but comprehensive, covering everything from the most efficient way to swing a rammer to sophisticated techniques for building walls on steep slopes or marshy ground. The accumulated experience represented by these various state walls was staggering in its scope and detail. Workers had learned to adapt their techniques to virtually every type of terrain found in China. They could build walls across desert sands, through mountain passes, along riverbanks, and over marshy ground. They had developed methods for incorporating natural barriers like cliffs and rivers into their defensive systems. They understood how to build walls that could withstand earthquakes, floods, extreme temperatures. and the various types of military attacks that enemies might mount. This practical knowledge extended to understanding the human factors that determined project success. Experienced supervisors knew how to organize work crews for maximum efficiency while minimizing the risk of accidents or conflicts between workers. They understood how to maintain morale during long, difficult projects by organizing work schedules that balanced productivity with rest. They had learned to identify and respond to the early signs of the diseases and injuries that could devastate work crews in remote construction sites. The economic systems supporting wall construction had become sophisticated as well. States had developed methods for calculating the costs of wall projects, including not just materials and direct labor costs, but the economic impact of removing workers from agricultural production. They had created supply chains that could deliver specialized materials to remote construction sites and established workshops that could produce tools and equipment specifically designed for wall construction. Perhaps most significantly, the various states had begun to recognize that their individual wall-building efforts were interconnected in ways that hadn't been obvious when the first defensive walls were built. The Zhao state's walls influenced where the Yan state built their walls, which in turn affected the defensive strategies of neighboring states. What had begun as independent responses to local military pressures had evolved into something approaching a regional system of fortification. This interconnectedness was creating strategic and tactical pressures that would eventually make some form of unified approach almost inevitable. States were discovering that the effectiveness of their individual walls was limited by gaps in their neighbors' defenses. An enemy that could find a way through or around one state's walls could potentially attack other states from unexpected directions, making everyone's individual defensive investments less valuable. The workers building these walls were beginning to recognize these broader patterns as well. Crews working on different state projects would sometimes encounter each other when wall routes converged or when workers traveled between projects seeking employment. They would compare techniques and share innovations, creating an informal network of expertise that transcended state boundaries. The social impact of generations of wall construction was equally profound. Entire regions of China now had populations with direct experience in large-scale construction projects. The organizational and management skills developed in wall construction could be applied to other types of infrastructure projects. The technological innovations developed for wall construction improved tools, better materials, more efficient work methods had applications in building cities, roads, and other defensive installations. But there was also a darker legacy. The human cost of these accumulated wall projects had been enormous. Thousands of workers had died in construction accidents, from diseases contracted in remote work sites or simply from exhaustion and malnutrition. Families had been disrupted, agricultural production had been repeatedly interrupted, and local economies had been distorted by the massive reallocation of labor from productive activities to military construction. Yet from the perspective of the individual worker pounding earth between wooden frames or hauling stones up mountain slopes, these broader historical patterns remained largely invisible. Their world was still defined by the immediate challenges of their work, the physical demands, the technical problems, a daily struggle to meet construction quotas while maintaining some semblance of normal life. What they couldn't know was that their accumulated expertise, their refined techniques, their established organizational systems, and their hard-won practical knowledge were about to be mobilized for a project that would dwarf everything that had come before. The scattered walls they had built, the skills they had developed, and the human infrastructure they had created were about to become the foundation for something that would transform their individual efforts into one of the most ambitious construction projects in human history. The stage was set for unification. Though the workers who had prepared that stage through generations of patient, dangerous, exhausting labor had no way of anticipating what was coming next. The year was 221 BC, and Emperor Qin Shi Huang had just accomplished something that had seemed impossible for centuries. He had unified all of China under a single ruler. The warring states that had spent generations building walls to defend against each other were now provinces in his empire. But instead of peace, the emperor found himself consumed by a fear that would drive him to order the largest construction project in human history up to that point. The fear began with a rumor. Tells us that Emperor Qin Shi Huang had sent a necromancer named Liu Shang to seek methods of achieving immortality. After countless empty-handed returns, Liu finally brought back not the secret of eternal life, but something that terrified the emperor even more, a rumor that his newly unified empire would be overturned by northern nomads. Whether Liu Shang had actually heard this rumor or invented it to deflect attention from his failures in finding immortality, we'll never know. But the emperor's response was immediate and massive. He ordered the connection and extension of all existing walls into a single, unified defensive system. To understand the magnitude of what this meant, you have to picture the existing walls scattered across the Chinese landscape like pieces of an enormous, incomplete puzzle. The former Qin state's walls ran through parts of what is now Gansu province. The old Jiao walls protected territory that stretched from Inner Mongolia to the North China Plain. The Yan walls defended the northeastern approaches to Beijing. Each had been built with different techniques, different standards, different strategic purposes, and most importantly, each ended where the next state had begun, leaving gaps that rendered the individual walls militarily useless against a coordinated invasion from the north. The emperor's order to connect these walls wasn't simply a matter of filling in the gaps. It required surveying thousands of miles of terrain to determine the best routes for connecting existing wall segments. It meant standardizing construction techniques across regions that had developed their own distinct approaches to wall building. Most importantly, it required mobilizing a labor force on a scale that had never been attempted in human history, provides the staggering numbers General Meng Tian was given. 300,000 soldiers for the initial phase of construction. Beyond this military force, an additional 500,000 peasants were conscripted through the corvée system, which required each citizen to provide 1 year of labor service to the emperor. This meant that roughly 800,000 people, representing perhaps 20% of the entire population of northern China, were simultaneously engaged in wall construction. But numbers alone can't convey the reality of what this meant for the individual workers, who found themselves part of this unprecedented project. Imagine being a farmer in what had been the kingdom of Shao, living a life defined by seasonal rhythms of planting and harvest, suddenly receiving orders to report for wall construction duty in a region hundreds of miles from your home, knowing that you might not return for a year or more, and knowing that the penalty for refusing was death. The logistics of organizing 800,000 workers across thousands of miles of difficult terrain were mind-boggling. Each worker needed to be fed, housed, supplied with tools, and provided with medical care when injured or sick. The quantity of food required was enormous. Each worker consumed just 2 pounds of grain per day. The project required 1,600,000 pounds of food daily, or nearly 600 million pounds per year. All of this food had to be grown, stored, transported, and distributed across construction sites that were often located in remote, mountainous regions with no existing transportation infrastructure. The construction sites themselves became temporary cities, some housing tens of thousands of workers at a time. These weren't planned communities with proper sanitation, organized food distribution, or adequate shelter. They were improvised settlements created by necessity in locations chosen for military rather than residential considerations. Workers lived in hastily constructed barracks, crude huts, or simply slept in the open when weather permitted. The daily routine at these massive construction sites was brutal and unchanging. Work began before dawn, when the air was cool and workers could accomplish more before the heat became unbearable. The first task was always moving materials, countless tons of earth. Stone, timber, and other supplies had to be transported from supply areas to active construction sites, often over distances of several miles and across terrain that was deliberately chosen for its defensive value, which usually meant it was difficult to traverse. The primary construction technique remained rammed earth. But the scale of the Qin project required innovations in how this technique was applied. Instead of the small work crews that had built the individual state walls, the Qin project employed massive teams that could work on multiple sections simultaneously. Wooden frames were constructed in standard sizes that could be prefabricated at supply depots and transported to work sites, allowing for faster construction and better quality control. The earth tamping process itself became a choreographed operation involving dozens of workers per section. Teams would spread earth within the wooden frames, while other teams with rammers would work in coordinated rhythms to compact each layer uniformly. The sound of hundreds of rammers working simultaneously must have been extraordinary percussion that could be heard for miles, marking the progress of construction from dawn to dusk, day after day, month after month. Quality control became a critical issue at this scale, with hundreds of separate work crews building different sections of the wall. Maintaining consistent construction standards required systematic inspection and supervision. Master builders would travel from site to site, checking the thickness of tamped earth layers, the height and width of wall sections, and the integration of new construction with existing wall segments. The integration of existing walls with new construction presented particular challenges. The old state walls had been built to different specifications, using different materials and techniques. Workers had to carefully evaluate existing wall segments to determine which sections could be incorporated into the new system and which needed to be rebuilt entirely. This required technical expertise that went beyond simple construction skills workers needed to understand structural engineering, materials science, and the long-term durability of different construction approaches. Weather became a constant enemy. Construction continued through winter months when temperatures dropped well below freezing, making earth tamping extremely difficult and dangerous. Workers had to develop techniques for preventing frost damage to newly constructed wall sections, often by covering fresh construction with straw mats or building fires near work areas to prevent the earth from freezing before it could properly set. Summer brought different challenges. The combination of heavy physical labor and extreme heat led to frequent cases of heat exhaustion and dehydration. Water sources had to be located and secured at every construction site, and workers had to be rotated frequently to prevent dangerous overexertion. The remote locations of many construction sites made medical care difficult to provide, and workers who became seriously ill or injured often had little chance of survival. The psychological toll was as severe as the physical demands. Workers were separated from their families and communities for extended periods, living in harsh conditions with inadequate food and shelter, performing dangerous, exhausting labor under constant supervision by military guards. The knowledge that failure to meet construction quotas could result in severe punishment, including death, created an atmosphere of constant stress and fear. Yet, despite these conditions, the project moved forward with remarkable speed. The emperor had set an aggressive timeline, and the military commanders responsible for overseeing construction drove the work crews relentlessly to meet deadlines. Sections of wall that had taken years to build during the Warring States period were now being completed in months through the application of massive labor forces and improved organizational systems. The scope of the project was becoming clear. As construction progressed, this wasn't simply a matter of connecting existing walls. It was the creation of an entirely new type of defensive system. It's designed to protect the entire northern frontier of the unified Chinese Empire. The wall would eventually stretch from the western deserts to the eastern sea, crossing every type of terrain that China contained and requiring engineering solutions too. Problems that had never been encountered in previous construction projects. But for the individual worker, hauling earth in wicker baskets or swinging a rammer in the endless rhythm of tamped earth construction, the scope and significance of the project remained abstract. Their world was defined by immediate, physical realities: the weight of the materials they carried, the pace of work demanded by their supervisors, the quality of the evening meal, the adequacy of their shelter, and the ever-present question of whether they would survive long enough to return home when their service was completed. What they couldn't know was that their daily labor was creating something that would endure for over 2 millennia, becoming one of the most recognizable human achievements in history. But neither could they know how many of their fellow workers would pay the ultimate price for that enduring achievement. The scale of Emperor Qin Shi Huang's wall project required engineering and organizational innovations that pushed ancient Chinese technology to its absolute limits. Tells us that by 214 BC, its construction had reached a length of 3,107 miles, representing not just an enormous construction achievement, but a revolution in how large-scale projects could be organized and executed. The logistics alone were staggering in their complexity. Consider the simple matter of tools. 800,000 workers required hundreds of thousands of rammers, shovels, baskets, carrying poles, ropes, chisels, hammers, and other implements. Each tool had to be manufactured, transported to construction sites, maintained during use, and replaced when worn out or broken. The Qin project required the establishment of mobile workshops at major construction sites, staffed by skilled craftsmen who could repair tools and manufacture replacements as needed. The wooden frames used for rammed earth construction had to be built to standardized specifications but adapted to varying terrain conditions. This required teams of skilled carpenters who could work with local materials to create frames that would maintain uniform wall dimensions while accommodating changes in elevation, ground conditions, and available materials. The frames themselves had to be sturdy enough to withstand the constant pounding of earth tamping, but light enough to be disassembled and moved to new locations as construction progressed. Transportation of materials became one of the most challenging aspects of the entire project. The wall route often followed mountain ridges and other elevated terrain that provided defensive disadvantages, but made transportation extremely difficult. Workers developed elaborate systems for moving materials up steep slopes, including human chains that could pass heavy stones hand-to-hand over distances of several miles, and simple pulley systems that could lift materials up cliff faces that were too steep for human porters. The quantities of materials required were almost incomprehensible. Modern estimates suggest that the various phases of Great Wall construction used approximately 100 million tons of materials. To put this in perspective, if each worker could transport 100 pounds of materials per day, it would require nearly 100,000 workers working full-time for an entire year just to move 18 million tons of materials, and that doesn't account for the actual construction work, preparation of materials, or any of the other activities necessary to complete the project. The earth used for rammed earth construction had to meet specific standards for composition and quality. Workers became expert at identifying suitable soil types, looking for earth that contained the right mixture of clay, sand, and organic material to achieve maximum hardness when tamped. Different soil types performed differently in various weather conditions, so construction techniques had to be adapted to local conditions while maintaining overall structural standards. Stone construction presented different challenges. In areas where stone was the primary building material, workers had to quarry, transport, and fit millions of individual stones. The quarrying process was entirely manual, using hammers, chisels, and wedges to break stones from natural formations. Each stone had to be shaped to appropriate dimensions, sorted by size and quality, and transported to construction sites. The fitting of stones required considerable skill, as workers had to create stable, weather-resistant walls without mortars or other binding agents. The integration of the various existing state walls into the unified system required careful engineering analysis. Each existing wall segment had to be evaluated for structural integrity, defensive effectiveness, and compatibility with the new system. Some sections could be incorporated with minimal modification, others required extensive reconstruction, and some had to be abandoned entirely in favor of new routes that better served the strategic purposes of the unified system. Water management became a critical engineering challenge. The wall crossed numerous rivers, streams, and seasonal drainage patterns. Workers had to develop techniques for building wall sections that could withstand flooding without compromising the overall defensive system. This often required the construction of elaborate drainage systems, including channels that could divert water away from wall foundations and gates that could be closed during flood periods. The construction of gates and defensive installations required specialized skills that went beyond basic wall construction. These installations had to accommodate the passage of friendly forces while providing strong, defensive positions against enemies. Workers had to learn masonry techniques for building gate foundations, carpentry skills for constructing wooden gate mechanisms, and basic engineering principles for creating defensive installations that could withstand siege warfare. Communication across the massive construction site was maintained through an elaborate system of signal fires, messengers, and standardized reporting procedures. Construction supervisors had to coordinate the work of thousands of crews scattered across hundreds of miles of terrain, ensuring that wall segments built by different crews would connect properly and that materials and workers were allocated efficiently across the entire project. The feeding of 800,000 workers required agricultural production and food distribution systems on a scale that had never been attempted. Entire regions were reorganized to support the wall construction, with agricultural areas designated specifically to produce food for construction crews. The logistics of transporting this food to remote construction sites required the development of supply chains that could move thousands of tons of grain, preserved vegetables, and other provisions across difficult terrain on a regular schedule. The preservation and storage of food became critical technical challenges. Construction sites were often located far from agricultural areas, and workers needed reliable food supplies throughout the year, including winter months when fresh transportation was impossible. Workers developed techniques for preserving meat through drying and salting, storing grain in underground chambers that could protect it from moisture and pests, and preparing concentrated foods that could provide adequate nutrition while minimizing transportation weight. Medical care for such a large workforce presented unprecedented challenges. Construction sites became breeding grounds for diseases that could spread rapidly through crowded, unsanitary conditions. Workers with medical knowledge had to develop treatments for common construction injuries, broken bones from falls, cuts from tools, strain injuries from heavy lifting, using only traditional remedies and basic surgical techniques. The mortality rate was enormous, with modern estimates suggesting that hundreds of thousands of workers died during the Qin construction period. The seasonal nature of agricultural labor created additional organizational complexities. Many workers were farmers who needed to return to their fields for planting and harvest seasons. This meant that the labor force fluctuated dramatically throughout the year, requiring construction supervisors to plan work activities around agricultural schedules while maintaining steady progress on the wall construction. Winter construction presented particular technical challenges. Rammed earth construction becomes extremely difficult when temperatures drop below freezing, as frozen earth cannot be properly compacted. Workers developed techniques for winter construction that included heating earth before tamping, constructing temporary shelters around work areas to maintain warmer temperatures, and modifying construction techniques to work with partially frozen materials. The standardization of construction techniques across the entire project required systematic training programs for workers and supervisors. Experienced workers from the former state wall projects became instructors, teaching standardized techniques to new workers and ensuring that construction quality remained consistent across the entire system. This knowledge transfer was crucial to maintaining structural integrity across wall sections, built by different crews under varying conditions. Quality control inspections were conducted by teams of master builders who traveled the entire wall route, checking construction standards and identifying sections that needed reconstruction or reinforcement. These inspections were comprehensive, examining not just the immediate structural integrity of wall sections, but their integration with adjacent sections, their ability to withstand various types of attacks, and their long-term durability under local weather conditions. The psychological management of such a large workforce became as important as the technical aspects of construction. Workers separated from their families and communities for extended periods, performing dangerous and exhausting labor under harsh conditions required careful management to maintain morale and prevent rebellions. Construction supervisors developed systems of rewards and punishments, rest schedules, and even entertainment activities to keep workers focused on their tasks. The integration of military personnel with civilian workers created additional organizational challenges. Soldiers brought discipline and technical skills, but they also brought military hierarchy and attitudes that could conflict with civilian workers' needs and expectations. The 300,000 soldiers assigned to the project had to be integrated with 500,000 civilian workers in ways that maximized the benefits of military organization while minimizing conflicts between different groups. The environmental impact of such massive construction was enormous and immediate. Entire hillsides were stripped of vegetation to provide materials and clear construction routes. Forests were harvested to provide timber for construction frameworks and fuel for heating and cooking. Rivers and streams were diverted to provide water for construction sites and prevent flooding of wall foundations. The ecological disruption extended far beyond the immediate construction zone, affecting agricultural areas that were pressed into service to support the project. Record keeping became essential for managing such a complex project. Detailed records had to be maintained of worker assignments, material allocations, construction progress, and quality inspections. These records had to be copied and distributed to multiple administrative centers to prevent loss and ensure coordination between different parts of the project. The administrative burden was enormous, requiring hundreds of clerks and administrators working full-time just to maintain the paperwork necessary to keep the project functioning. The economic impact extended throughout the entire Chinese empire. The massive reallocation of labor from agricultural production to wall construction created food shortages in some regions and labor shortages that affected other construction projects and economic activities. The costs of the project were enormous, requiring tax increases and the reallocation of government resources on a scale that affected every aspect of imperial administration. Yet, despite these enormous challenges, the project continued to advance with remarkable speed and efficiency. The combination of massive labor forces, improved organizational techniques, and standardized construction methods allowed the Qin project to achieve in years what had previously taken decades. By 212 BC, just 2 years after major construction began, the wall system extended from Gansu in the west to the coast of southern Manchuria in the east. The workers themselves, focused on their daily tasks of hauling materials and tamping earth, could see only small sections of the overall project. But the cumulative effect of their individual efforts was creating something unprecedented in human history, a continuous defensive barrier stretching across an entire continent, built to standards of construction and engineering that would enable it to survive for over 2 millennia. What they couldn't know was that their emperor's obsession with creating an impregnable defensive system It cost hundreds of thousands of lives and create social and economic disruptions that would contribute to the collapse of the very dynasty they were working to protect. The wall would outlive its builder by more than 2,000 years, but the human cost of its construction would be felt for generations. By 210 BC, Emperor Qin Shi Huang's wall project had achieved something that would have seemed impossible just a decade earlier. The scattered defensive walls of the former warring states had been connected, extended, and unified into a continuous barrier stretching over 3,000 miles across northern China. But this monumental achievement had come at a human cost that was staggering even. By the standards of ancient warfare and construction projects, provides the sobering statistics of the estimated BHE. Of the estimated, 2 participated in the Qin Wall construction. Approximately 400,000 died during the project. This means that 1 out of every 2 workers who began the project never returned home. The wall had become, in the words of later historians, the longest cemetery in the world, with bodies of dead workers reportedly buried directly in the wall structure itself when proper burial became impractical. The causes of this massive mortality were varied, but predictable, given the scale and conditions of the project. Construction accidents were frequent and often fatal. Workers hauling heavy stones up steep mountain slopes faced constant risk of falls that could kill them instantly or leave them with injuries that would prove fatal in the absence of adequate medical care. The primitive lifting and transportation. Equipment regularly failed under the enormous loads it was asked to bear, crushing workers who happened to be in the wrong place when ropes snapped or wooden frameworks collapsed. Disease was an even greater killer than accidents. The crowded, unsanitary conditions at construction sites created perfect environments for the spread of infectious diseases. Workers weakened by inadequate food, exhaustion, and exposure to harsh weather had little resistance to illnesses that might have been survivable under better conditions. Dysentery, pneumonia, and various fever-producing infections spread rapidly through work crews, sometimes killing dozens of workers in a single camp within a matter of days. Malnutrition was endemic throughout the project. The logistics of feeding 800,000 workers in remote locations were beyond the capacity of the era's transportation and preservation systems. Workers frequently received inadequate rations of poor quality food, leading to widespread vitamin deficiencies, weakened immune systems, and reduced capacity for the heavy physical labor that wall construction required. Many workers simply wasted away, their bodies unable to sustain the caloric demands of construction work on insufficient nutrition. The psychological toll was equally devastating. Workers separated from their families for months or years, living under harsh conditions with constant threat of punishment for inadequate performance, experienced what we would now recognize as severe depression and anxiety disorders. Some workers simply gave up, refusing to work or eat, effectively committing suicide through passive resistance. Others attempted to escape, though capture meant certain death, making this a form of delayed suicide as well. The social impact extended far beyond the construction sites themselves. Villages throughout northern China were stripped of their adult male populations, leaving women, children, and elderly people to manage agricultural work that had previously required full community participation. Agricultural production declined significantly, leading to food shortages that compounded the challenges of feeding construction crews and maintaining adequate nutrition for the general population. Families were destroyed by the project's demands. Children grew up without fathers, wives became widows without knowing whether their husbands were dead or simply delayed, and elderly parents lost the sons who would have cared for them in their final years. The social fabric of entire regions was torn apart by the massive conscription of workers for wall construction. The economic impact was equally severe. The removal of hundreds of thousands of workers from agricultural production created labor shortages that reduced crop yields and disrupted local economies. The resources devoted to wall construction materials, Tools, transportation, administration represented a massive reallocation of wealth from productive economic activity to military construction. Tax burdens increased dramatically to fund the project, impoverishing populations that were already struggling with the disruptions caused by forced labor conscription. Regional development was distorted by the project's demands. Areas near the wall route were required to provide materials and support services, disrupting their normal economic activities and forcing them to specialize in construction-related production. Areas far from the wall route were required to increase agricultural production to feed construction crews, preventing them from developing other economic activities that might have improved their long-term prosperity. The environmental damage was extensive and long-lasting. Massive deforestation occurred as construction crews harvested timber for frameworks, fuel, and tools. Entire mountainsides were stripped of vegetation to provide construction materials and clear building sites. Rivers and streams were diverted or dammed to provide water for construction sites, affecting agricultural areas downstream and disrupting natural ecosystems. The quality of construction suffered as the project's scale and timeline pushed workers beyond their physical and technical limits. Sections of wall built under extreme time pressure with inadequate materials and exhausted workers proved less durable than earlier construction, requiring reconstruction within decades of their initial completion. The rush to complete the project meant that many sections were built to minimal standards that would require constant maintenance and periodic rebuilding. Yet from the emperor's perspective, the project was a remarkable success. The unified wall system provided the northern frontier defense that he had sought, creating a barrier that would deter nomadic invasions for centuries. The project demonstrated the organizational capabilities of the unified Chinese state and served as a powerful symbol of imperial authority. The techniques and knowledge developed during construction would be applied to other imperial projects, including roads, canals, and cities. The workers who survived the project carried with them detailed knowledge of large-scale construction techniques that would prove invaluable in future projects. They had learned to organize massive workforces, coordinate complex logistics, and execute construction projects on scales that had never been attempted before. This knowledge would be passed down through generations, contributing to China's continued leadership in engineering and construction throughout its history. The wall itself would prove remarkably durable, with major sections remaining intact and functional for over 2 millennia. The construction standards developed during the Qin project, despite being implemented under extreme conditions, proved sound enough to create structures that would outlast not only their builders, but dozens of subsequent dynasties. The engineering solutions developed to build walls across deserts, mountains, and rivers would influence construction techniques throughout China and beyond. But the immediate human cost was devastating and irreversible. The 400,000 workers who died during construction left behind families, communities, and economic activities that would never fully recover. The social disruption caused by the project contributed to rebellions and unrest that would eventually destroy the Qin dynasty. Despite its impressive military and construction achievements, the paradox of the Qin Wall project was that its very success contained the seeds of its builders' destruction. The emperor's ability to mobilize enormous resources and labor forces for wall construction demonstrated the power of unified Chinese government, but the social and economic costs of exercising that power created the conditions that would lead to the dynasty's collapse. The wall would survive its builders by more than 2,000 years, standing as both a monument to their achievement and a testament to the human cost of imperial ambition. For the individual workers who participated in the project, whether they survived or died, the experience was defined not by its historical significance, but by its immediate physical and emotional reality. They had participated in one of humanity's greatest construction achievements, but at a personal cost that few would have chosen to pay had they understood the true price of that achievement. Nearly 15 centuries had passed since Emperor Qin Huang's workers had tamped their last section of earth into wooden frames along China's northern frontier. The original Great Wall had endured invasions, weathering, earthquakes, and the simple passage of time, but by the 14th century AD, much of it had crumbled beyond recognition. Sections that had once stood proud and intimidating were now little more than earthen mounds overgrown with vegetation. Stone sections had been robbed for building materials by local residents, and wooden elements had long since rotted away or been harvested for fuel. The Ming Dynasty, which came to power in 1368 AD, faced the same fundamental problem that had driven Emperor Qin Shi Huang to build his wall pressure from northern nomadic groups who threatened Chinese agricultural settlements and trade routes. But the Ming emperors had advantages that their ancient predecessors could never have imagined: over a millennium of additional technological development, more sophisticated organizational systems, and, most importantly, a construction material that would revolutionize wall building explains that the Ming Dynasty Great Wall was built primarily with bricks, a fundamental change from the rammed earth construction that had dominated earlier wall building. This shift to brick construction represented not just a change in materials, but a complete transformation in how large-scale construction projects could be organized and executed. The decision to use bricks wasn't made lightly or suddenly. Ming engineers had studied the remains of earlier walls and understood their structural limitations. Rammed earth walls, while cheaper and faster to build, were vulnerable to water damage, earthquake damage, and gradual erosion that required constant maintenance. Stone walls were more durable but required enormous amounts of skilled labor and could only be built in areas where suitable stone was available. Bricks offered the best combination of durability, workability, and consistency that could be achieved with Ming-era technology, but building walls with bricks required solving problems that earlier wall builders had never faced. Bricks had to be manufactured in enormous quantities to standardized specifications. The clay used for brick making had to meet specific requirements for composition and quality. Kilns had to be designed and built that could fire bricks consistently and efficiently. Most challenging of all, brick construction required binding agents mortar that could hold the bricks together. Under the stresses of wall construction and the various forces that walls would face over their lifetimes, the Ming solution was to establish brick and cement factories directly at construction sites, using locally available materials to produce both bricks and the lime mortar needed to bind them together. This approach solved several problems simultaneously. It reduced the transportation costs of moving heavy materials over long distances. It ensured that materials were specifically adapted to local conditions, and it provided quality control over the entire production process. The establishment of these on-site factories represented a major innovation in construction logistics. Each factory required skilled workers who understood the technical requirements of brick making and mortar production. Clay had to be extracted, processed, and formed into uniform bricks. Limestone had to be quarried, processed in kilns to produce lime, and then mixed with water and other materials to create mortar with the right consistency and setting properties. The brick-making process itself was far more complex than the simple earth tamping of earlier construction. Clay had to be selected for its composition, ensuring it contained the right mixture of materials to produce strong, weather-resistant bricks when fired. The clay had to be prepared by removing impurities, achieving uniform consistency, and sometimes mixing in additives that would improve the final product's qualities. The forming of bricks required standardized molds that would produce uniform dimensions across all production sites. These molds had to be precisely constructed and carefully maintained to ensure that bricks from different factories would fit together properly in wall construction. Workers had to learn techniques for filling molds completely while avoiding air bubbles or other defects that could weaken the finished bricks. The firing process was perhaps the most technically demanding aspect of brick production. Kilns had to be designed that could achieve and maintain the high temperatures necessary to properly fire clay into brick, while ensuring uniform heating throughout the kiln chamber. The firing process had to be carefully controlled to prevent overfiring, which could make bricks brittle, or underfiring, which could leave them soft and vulnerable to water damage. Fuel for the kilns was a major logistical challenge. Brick production required enormous quantities of combustible materials: wood, charcoal, or other fuels that had to be gathered from local sources or transported to construction sites. In many areas, the fuel requirements for brick production led to significant deforestation as construction crews harvested every available source of combustible material within economical transportation distance. The lime production for mortar involved its own set of technical challenges. Limestone suitable for lime production had to be identified and quarried, often from locations that were not immediately adjacent to construction sites. The limestone had to be processed in specially designed kilns that could achieve the high temperatures necessary to convert limestone into lime. The resulting lime had to be carefully stored and protected from moisture until it could be mixed with water and other materials to create mortar. The mortar mixing process required considerable skill and experience. The proportions of lime, water, sand, and other additives had to be precisely controlled to create mortar with the right consistency for bricklaying, while ensuring that it would set properly and provide long-term adhesion. Different weather conditions required adjustments to mortar composition, and workers had to learn to adapt their mixing techniques to local conditions and materials. The logistics of coordinating brick production, mortar production, and wall construction created organizational challenges that were far more complex than those faced by earlier rammed earth construction. Brick production had to be scheduled to ensure adequate supplies were available when construction crews needed them. But bricks couldn't be produced too far in advance because storage and transportation of large quantities of bricks presented their own problems. Quality control became more critical and more complex with brick construction. Each brick had to meet standards for dimensions, strength, and appearance. Mortar had to be tested to ensure it would provide adequate adhesion and weather resistance. The actual bricklaying had to be inspected to ensure proper technique and adequate quality of workmanship. The skills required for brick construction were significantly different from those needed for rammed earth construction. Workers had to learn masonry techniques for laying bricks in proper patterns with adequate mortar coverage. They had to develop judgment about mortar consistency, brick quality, and construction techniques that would ensure long-term structural integrity. The seasonal constraints on brick construction were different from those affecting rammed earth construction. Mortar setting was affected by temperature and humidity, making some weather conditions unsuitable for bricklaying. The brick production process was also affected by weather, as clay preparation and brick drying required specific conditions for optimal results. But the advantages of brick construction, once these technical and organizational challenges were mastered, were enormous. Brick walls could be built to more precise specifications than rammed earth walls. They were more resistant to weather damage and required less maintenance over their lifetimes. Most importantly, they could be built to heights and configurations that would have been impossible with earlier construction techniques. The Ming wall builders were not simply rebuilding the ancient wall. They were creating an entirely new type of defensive system using construction techniques that represented centuries of technological advancement. The workers who learned these new techniques were participating in a revolution in construction technology that would influence building practices throughout China for centuries to come. What they couldn't know was that their daily work of making bricks, mixing mortar, and laying stone was creating structures that would become the Great Wall of China as it's known today, the wall that millions of tourists would visit, the wall that would become one of the most recognizable human achievements in history. Their technical innovations and construction skills were creating something that would endure long after the military purposes that drove its construction had become obsolete. The Ming Dynasty's approach to Great Wall construction represented a fundamental shift from the pragmatic, make-do methods of earlier periods to something approaching modern engineering science. The technical innovations developed during Ming construction would not only create the most durable sections of the Great Wall, but would also establish construction principles that would influence Chinese building practices for centuries. The standardization of brick production across the entire wall project required the development of specifications that would ensure consistency regardless of local conditions or materials. Ming engineers established standard dimensions for wall bricks typically measuring about 15 inches long, 7 inches wide, and 3 inches thick that would provide optimal structural properties while remaining manageable for individual workers to handle efficiently. But achieving these standard dimensions with the materials and techniques available in the Ming period required solving numerous technical problems. Clay sources varied significantly in their composition, mineral content, and working properties from region to region. Ming brickmakers had to learn to adjust their production techniques to achieve consistent results despite these variations in raw materials. The clay preparation process became a sophisticated operation involving multiple stages of processing and quality control. Raw clay had to be weathered exposed to repeated cycles of wetting and drying, freezing and thawing to break down large particles and achieve uniform consistency. This weathering process could take months, requiring construction planners to begin clay preparation well in advance of actual brick production. After weathering, the clay had to be processed to remove impurities such as stones, organic matter, and materials with different thermal expansion properties that could cause bricks to crack during firing. This processing was done entirely by hand, with workers spending hours sifting through clay to remove unwanted materials and achieve the uniform consistency necessary for quality brick production. The addition of tempering materials to the clay required careful experimentation and testing. Sand was commonly added to reduce shrinkage during drying and firing, but the type and quantity of sand had to be adjusted based on the characteristics of the local clay. Too little sand could result in excessive shrinkage and cracking. Too much could weaken the finished bricks. Some Ming brickmakers experimented with organic additives, such as rice husks or straw, that could improve the working properties of clay, while burning out during firing to create slightly lighter bricks. The molding process required precision and consistency that could only be achieved through systematic training and quality control. Workers had to learn to pack clay into molds with uniform density, ensuring that bricks would shrink evenly during drying and firing. The timing of mold removal was critical too early, and bricks would deform under their own weight. Too late, and they would stick to molds and be damaged during removal. Drying of formed bricks was a complex process that had to be carefully controlled to prevent cracking and warping. Bricks had to be dried slowly and evenly, protected from direct sunlight and wind that could cause rapid moisture loss leading to surface cracking. The drying process typically took several weeks, during which bricks had to be regularly turned and inspected for defects. The kiln design used for Ming brick production represented centuries of refinement in ceramic technology. These kilns had to achieve temperatures of approximately 1,000 degrees Celsius, while maintaining uniform heating throughout the firing chamber. The design typically involved a firebox connected to a chamber containing the bricks, with carefully designed passages that would distribute heat evenly while allowing combustion gases to escape. The firing process itself required constant attention and adjustment by skilled workers who could judge temperature and firing progress by observing flame color, smoke characteristics, and other visual cues. The complete firing cycle typically took several days, during which the kilns had to be continuously fueled and monitored. Underfiring would produce bricks that were weak and vulnerable to water damage. while overfiring could make bricks brittle and prone to cracking. Quality control for finished bricks involved both visual inspection and practical testing. Workers learned to identify quality bricks by their color, which should be uniform and appropriate for the local clay and firing conditions. They tested bricks by striking them with hammers to listen for the clear, ringing sound that indicated proper firing and structural integrity. Bricks that produced dull or hollow sounds were rejected as likely to fail in construction. The production of lime mortar required equally sophisticated technical knowledge and quality control. Limestone suitable for lime production had to meet specific requirements for chemical composition and physical characteristics. The limestone had to be relatively pure calcium carbonate, free from impurities that could affect the setting properties or long-term durability of the resulting mortars. The lime burning process involved heating limestone to temperatures high enough to drive off carbon dioxide, converting calcium carbonate to calcium oxide quicklime. This process required kilns similar to those used for brick firing, but with different temperature profiles and firing schedules. The conversion had to be complete, but not excessive, as overburning could produce lime that would set too quickly or fail to achieve adequate strength. The conversion of quicklime to lime mortar was a potentially dangerous process that required careful handling and precise technique. Quicklime had to be slaked by mixing with water, a process that generated considerable heat and could cause serious burns if not handled properly. The slaking process had to be carefully controlled to achieve the right consistency and working properties for the specific construction applications. Ming mortar makers discovered that the addition of certain materials could significantly improve the performance of lime. Mortar mentions that glutinous rice flour was used as an additive in some mortar mixtures, providing enhanced adhesion and water resistance. This innovation demonstrated the sophisticated understanding of materials science that Ming construction crews had developed through experimentation and experience. The proportioning of mortar ingredients required careful attention to local conditions and intended applications. Mortars used for laying bricks and wall faces needed different properties than mortars used for pointing joints or filling gaps. Weather conditions at the time of construction affected mortar setting, requiring adjustments to mixture proportions and application techniques. The actual technique of bricklaying required skills that went far beyond simply stacking bricks with mortar between them. Workers had to learn to apply mortars in uniform thicknesses that would provide adequate adhesion while preventing excess mortar from being squeezed out of joints. They had to understand how to build corners, intersections, and openings while maintaining structural integrity and proper load distribution. The construction of more complex elements, such as arches, drainage systems, and defensive installations, required advanced masonry skills that took years to develop. Workers had to understand structural principles that would ensure these elements could support the loads they would carry while withstanding the various forces they would encounter during their service lives. Weather protection during construction became more critical with brick and mortar construction than it had been with rammed earth techniques. Newly laid brickwork had to be protected from rain that could wash out mortar before it had properly set. Freezing temperatures could prevent proper mortar setting or cause damage to newly constructed sections. Hot, dry weather could cause mortars to set too quickly, preventing proper adhesion to bricks. The seasonal scheduling of construction activities became more complex as a result of these weather sensitivities. Construction had to be planned around weather patterns, with different types of work scheduled for different seasons based on their requirements for temperature, humidity, and protection from precipitation. The quality of Ming brick and mortar construction is demonstrated by the durability of wall sections that survive today. Modern analysis of Ming wall construction shows sophisticated understanding of structural engineering principles, materials, science, and construction techniques that produced results comparable to much more recent construction using modern materials and methods. The workers who developed and implemented these techniques were participating in a revolution in construction. technology that would influence building practices throughout China and beyond. Their daily work of mixing mortar, laying bricks, and solving technical problems was advancing the state of engineering knowledge in ways that would benefit construction projects for centuries to come. What they accomplished through patient experimentation, careful observation, and systematic improvement of techniques was the creation of construction methods that would produce some of the most durable and impressive architectural achievements in human history. Their technical innovations were creating structures that would outlast the civilization that built them, standing as monuments to the sophistication and skill of Ming-era construction technology. By the time Ming Dynasty construction was completed, in the early 17th century, the Great Wall had been transformed from the earthen ramparts of ancient times into something that would have been almost unrecognizable to Emperor Qin Shi Huang's workers. The Ming Wall stretched approximately 5,500 miles, incorporating not just linear defensive barriers, but a comprehensive military infrastructure that included fortresses, beacon towers, garrison camps, and supply depots integrated into a unified defensive system. Tells us that the Ming construction used approximately 100 million tons of materials, representing what was probably the largest construction project in human history in terms of total material moved and processed. But these numbers, impressive as they are, don't convey the sophistication of engineering and construction techniques that the Ming builders had developed through centuries of experience and innovation. The wall that tourists visit today is primarily the result of Ming construction, and its features reflect the advanced engineering capabilities that Ming builders had developed. The typical Ming wall section was built to precise specifications, approximately 20 to 25 feet high, 15 to 30 feet wide at the base, and 12 to 15 feet wide at the top. These dimensions were carefully calculated to provide optimal defensive capabilities, while ensuring structural stability under the various loads and forces the wall would encounter. The construction details reveal the sophisticated understanding of engineering principles that Ming builders had achieved. The foundation systems were designed to transfer wall loads safely to underlying soil or rock, with foundation depths and widths varied according to local ground conditions. Drainage systems were integrated into wall design to prevent water damage, with carefully designed channels and outlets that would direct water away from structural elements while maintaining defensive integrity. The bricklaying patterns used in Ming construction demonstrate advanced understanding of masonry structural principles. Bricks were laid in running bond patterns that distributed loads effectively while providing resistance to various types of structural failure. Corner and intersection construction used specialized patterns that provided additional strength where different wall sections met or where defensive installations were integrated into the basic wall structure. The mortar joints in Ming construction were designed and executed with precision that rivals modern masonry work. Joint thicknesses were kept uniform to ensure even load distribution and proper structural behavior. Joint profiles were designed to shed water while providing maximum contact area between mortars and brick surfaces. The pointing and finishing of joints was done with care that ensured both structural integrity and weather resistance. The integration of defensive features into the basic wall structure required sophisticated engineering analysis and construction techniques. Battlements were designed to provide protection for defenders while allowing effective use of weapons. Embrasures were precisely sized and positioned to optimize defensive coverage while maintaining structural strength. Guard towers were positioned according to sightlines and communication requirements while being structurally integrated into the wall system. The beacon tower system represented a particularly sophisticated application of engineering principles to military requirements. These towers had to be tall enough to provide long-distance visibility, while being strong enough to withstand both military attacks and natural forces such as earthquakes and high winds. The construction techniques used for these towers incorporated advanced understanding of structural dynamics and foundation design. The construction of gates and defensive installations required the most advanced engineering and construction skills available to Ming builders. These installations had to accommodate the conflicting requirements of allowing passage for friendly forces while providing strong defensive positions against enemies. The structural systems had to support heavy defensive equipment while withstanding the forces generated by siege warfare. The water management systems integrated into Ming wall construction demonstrate sophisticated understanding of hydraulic engineering principles. The wall crossed numerous rivers and streams, requiring bridge construction, culvert systems, and flood protection measures that would maintain defensive integrity while allowing natural water flow. These systems had to be designed to handle extreme flood conditions while providing long-term durability with minimal maintenance. The supply and logistics systems supporting Ming construction had evolved into sophisticated operations that could sustain construction activities across thousands of miles of difficult terrain. Transportation systems could move materials efficiently from production sites to construction locations. Storage systems could maintain adequate supplies of materials and tools at construction sites while protecting them from weather and theft. The workforce management systems developed during Ming construction represented advanced understanding of organizational principles and human resource management. Training programs could quickly develop skilled workers from general laborers. Quality control systems ensured consistent construction standards across the entire project. Safety procedures reduced construction accidents and injuries compared to earlier construction periods. The economic impact of Ming wall construction was enormous, but more systematically managed than earlier projects. The construction was integrated into broader economic planning that minimized disruption to agricultural production and other economic activities. The development of construction-related industries provided economic benefits that partially offset the costs of wall construction. The technological innovations developed during Ming construction had applications far beyond wall building. The brick production techniques, mortar formulations, and construction methods developed for wall construction were applied to other building projects throughout China. The organizational and management systems developed for wall construction influenced other large-scale projects and contributed to the development of more sophisticated government administration. The environmental impact of Ming construction, while substantial, was more carefully managed than in earlier periods. Reforestation programs were sometimes implemented to replace forests harvested for construction materials. Agricultural areas disrupted by construction activities were systematically restored when construction was completed. The long-term planning involved in Ming construction allowed for better management of environmental impacts. The quality of Ming construction is demonstrated by the survival of major wall sections for over 400 years, with relatively minimal maintenance. Modern engineering analysis of Ming wall sections shows construction quality that meets or exceeds standards that would be expected for comparable modern construction. The structural systems have proven capable of withstanding earthquakes, extreme weather, and the normal aging processes that affect all construction over extended periods. The Ming Wall represents not just a military fortification, but a comprehensive demonstration of advanced engineering and construction capabilities. The techniques developed during its construction influenced building practices throughout China and contributed to the technological foundation that would support China's continued development as one of the world's leading civilizations. The workers who built the Ming Wall were creating something that would become one of the most recognizable human achievements in history. Their technical skills, organizational capabilities, and engineering innovations were producing a structure that would outlast the military purposes that originally justified its construction, becoming instead a symbol of human capability and determination. The wall they built through years of patient, skilled labor would eventually be recognized as one of the wonders of the world, attracting millions of visitors who would marvel at the engineering achievements and construction quality. That Ming workers had accomplished using techniques and materials that seem primitive by modern standards, but were actually the culmination of centuries of technological development and practical experience. When you stand on the Great Wall today, looking out over the mountains and valleys that stretch endlessly in both directions, it's difficult to imagine the human cost that each stone beneath your feet represents. The popular saying that the Great Wall is the longest cemetery in the world isn't mere dramatic exaggeration. It's a statistical reality that becomes more staggering the more deeply you examine the numbers involved in over 2 millennia of construction provides the most commonly accepted estimates. More than 1 million laborers were recruited for Great Wall construction across all dynasties, and approximately 400,000 of them died during the work. But these numbers, shocking as they are, represent only the deaths that occurred during active construction. They don't account for workers who died shortly after completing their service from injuries or illnesses contracted during construction. Nor do they include the broader social costs, the families destroyed, the communities disrupted, the economics opportunities lost when hundreds of thousands of people were diverted from productive activities to military construction. To understand the human reality behind these statistics, you have to consider what a 50% mortality rate meant for the individuals involved. Imagine being conscripted for wall construction, knowing that you had only a 50-50 chance of surviving to return home. Imagine the families who sent fathers, sons, and brothers to wall construction, knowing that half of them would never return. Imagine the communities that had to function after losing large portions of their adult male population to construction. Projects that might continue for years or decades. The causes of death during wall construction were varied but predictable, given the working conditions and available medical knowledge. Construction accidents were frequent and often fatal in an era before safety equipment, proper lifting techniques, or emergency medical care. Workers hauling massive stones up steep mountain slopes using primitive ropes and pulleys faced constant risk of being crushed when equipment failed. Falls from walls, scaffolding, or cliff faces were common and usually fatal given the heights involved, and the lack of medical facilities at remote construction sites. Disease was probably the greatest killer of all. The crowded, unsanitary conditions at construction camps created perfect environments for the spread of infectious diseases. Workers weakened by inadequate nutrition, exhaustion, and exposure to harsh weather had little resistance to illnesses that might have been survivable under better conditions. Dysentery, pneumonia, typhoid, and various epidemic diseases could sweep through construction camps, killing dozens or hundreds of workers within days. Malnutrition was endemic throughout most wall construction projects. The logistics of feeding hundreds of thousands of workers in remote locations stretched ancient transportation and food preservation systems beyond their capabilities. Workers frequently received inadequate rations of poor quality food, leading to vitamin deficiencies, weakened immune systems, and reduced capacity for the heavy physical labor that construction required. Many workers simply wasted away, their bodies unable to sustain the caloric demands of construction work on insufficient nutrition. The seasonal nature of construction work created additional health hazards. Workers had to continue construction activities through harsh winters, when temperatures dropped well below freezing and summer heat that could reach dangerous levels. Exposure to extreme weather combined with inadequate shelter and clothing led to widespread cases of frostbite, heat exhaustion, and exposure-related illnesses that were often fatal in the absence of proper medical care. Work-related injuries were constant hazards that could quickly become fatal. Cuts from tools, strains from heavy lifting, burns from fires and kilns, and crush injuries from falling materials were everyday occurrences. Without proper medical treatment, even relatively minor injuries could become infected and lead to death. The remote locations of construction sites meant that seriously injured workers often had little chance of receiving the care they needed to survive. The psychological toll was as devastating as the physical dangers. Workers separated from their families and communities for months or years, living under harsh conditions with constant threat of punishment for inadequate performance, experienced what we would now recognize as severe depression and anxiety disorders. Some workers simply gave up, refusing to work or eat, effectively committing suicide rather than continuing to endure the conditions. Others attempted to escape, though capture usually meant execution, making escape attempts essentially delayed. Suicide. The social impact extended far beyond the construction sites themselves, explains that entire communities were disrupted by the massive conscription of workers. Villages throughout northern China were stripped of their adult male populations, leaving women, children, and elderly people to manage agricultural work and other essential activities that had previously required full community participation. The economic consequences were equally severe. Agricultural production declined significantly when farmers were conscripted for construction work, leading to food shortages that affected entire regions. Local economies were disrupted when craftsmen, merchants, and other skilled workers were taken from their normal occupations. The resources devoted to wall construction, materials, tools, transportation, administration represented massive reallocation of wealth from productive economic activities to military construction. The disruption of family structures had long-lasting effects that extended far beyond the construction periods. Children grew up without fathers, leaving them without the economic support, skill training, and social guidance that fathers traditionally provided. Women became widows without knowing whether their husbands were dead or simply delayed, creating legal and social complications that could persist for years. Elderly parents lost the sons who would have provided care and support in their final years. The regional variations in construction mortality tell stories of particular tragedy. During the Qin construction period, entire regions were reportedly depopulated by the combination of worker conscription and high mortality rates. Some areas never fully recovered their pre-construction population levels, leading to permanent changes in settlement patterns and agricultural productivity. The methods used to dispose of dead workers reveal the scale of mortality and the callous attitudes toward worker welfare. Bodies were often buried directly in wall construction when proper burial became impractical due to the numbers involved and the remote locations of construction sites. This practice, while efficient from a construction management perspective, demonstrates how completely worker welfare was subordinated to construction goals. The record-keeping systems of various dynasties provide glimpses into the administrative approach to worker mortality. Deaths were recorded primarily for purposes of managing replacement workers rather than out of concern for the human cost. The bureaucratic language used to describe worker death terms, like wastage and losses, reveals attitudes that viewed workers as expendable resources rather than human beings with families and communities. Yet despite these horrific conditions and massive mortality rates, wall construction continued for over 2 millennia. The combination of imperial authority, military necessity, and the availability of large populations that could be conscripted for construction meant that high mortality rates were simply accepted as inevitable costs of building defensive systems. The scale of Chinese population and the organizational capabilities of Chinese governments made it possible to absorb these losses and continue construction despite their human cost. The workers themselves, facing these conditions day after day, developed coping mechanisms and support systems that helped some of them survive experiences that killed their companions. Informal networks provided mutual aid during illness and injury. Experienced workers shared knowledge about survival techniques, construction shortcuts, and ways to avoid the most dangerous assignments. Religious and cultural practices provided psychological support during periods of extreme hardship. The families left behind developed their own survival strategies. Women took on economic and social roles traditionally reserved for men. Communities reorganized their labor systems to function with reduced adult populations. Extended family networks provided support for families that had lost their primary breadwinners to construction projects. The long-term demographic impact of wall construction was substantial, but often overlooked in historical accounts focused on military and political achievements. The removal of hundreds of thousands of young men from reproductive activities had lasting effects on population growth and community development. The economic losses from diverted labor had effects that persisted for generations after construction was completed. What makes these statistics particularly poignant is that they represent not just numbers, but individual human tragedies multiplied hundreds of thousands of times. Each death represented a family destroyed, a community diminished, a lifetime of potential contributions lost. The Great Wall stands today as a monument not just to engineering achievement and imperial ambition, but to the enormous human cost of those achievements. To truly understand the human cost of Great Wall construction, you need to move beyond statistics and consider the individual experiences of the people whose lives were consumed by these projects. The historical records, focused as they are on imperial decisions and construction achievements, rarely provide details about individual workers. But the scattered evidence that does exist paints a picture of human suffering that is almost incomprehensible in its scale and intensity. Consider the experience of a typical farmer conscripted for wall construction during the Qin period. Tells us that conscription could take a man away from his family and village for a year or more, often during critical agricultural seasons when his labor was most needed at home. The conscript would typically receive only a few days' notice before being required to report to assembly points, often located far from his home village. The journey to construction sites was itself dangerous and difficult. Conscripts had to walk hundreds of miles across rough terrain, carrying whatever personal possessions and tools they could manage. They received minimal food and no shelter during these journeys, which could take weeks to complete. Many workers arrived at construction sites already weakened by malnutrition and exhaustion from the journey itself. Upon arrival at construction sites, workers found themselves in conditions that were barely adequate for survival, let alone for the heavy physical labor required for wall construction. Housing consisted of crude barracks, simple huts, or in many cases just sleeping in the open air regardless of weather conditions. Sanitation facilities were minimal or non-existent, creating environments where diseases could spread rapidly through crowded populations. The daily routine at construction sites was brutal and unchanging. Work began before dawn and continued until dark, with only brief breaks for meals. The work itself was physically demanding beyond anything most workers had previously experienced. Hauling earth and stone, digging foundations, lifting heavy materials to wall heights, and the constant pounding required for rammed earth construction pushed workers to the limits of human endurance day after day. Food at construction sites was inadequate both in quantity and quality. Workers typically received simple rations of grain, often of poor quality, with occasional supplements of vegetables or preserved meat. The total caloric content was usually insufficient for the heavy labor demanded, leading to gradual starvation even when workers weren't technically going without food. Malnutrition weakened workers' resistance to disease and reduced their capacity for the physical demands of construction. Medical care was virtually non-existent at most construction sites. Workers who became ill or injured had to rely on traditional remedies and the help of their fellow workers. Serious injuries or illnesses were usually fatal, as there were no facilities or trained personnel to provide the care needed for recovery. Workers who became unable to work were often simply abandoned to die rather than being provided with care or transportation back to their homes. The psychological pressures were as severe as the physical hardships. Workers were separated from their families and communities for extended periods with no reliable communication and no assurance that they would ever return home. The constant threat of punishment for inadequate work performance combined with witnessing the death and suffering of fellow workers created levels of stress and despair that would be considered traumatic by any standard. The social dynamics at construction sites reflected the broader hierarchies of Chinese society, but were complicated by the extreme conditions and the mixing of people from different regions and social backgrounds. Soldiers, peasants, and convicted criminals worked side by side under conditions that broke down many normal social distinctions. Conflicts between different groups were common, adding social tension to the already overwhelming physical and psychological stresses. The seasonal variations in construction work created additional hardships. Winter construction in northern China meant working in temperatures well below freezing, often without adequate clothing or shelter. Workers had to continue construction activities despite conditions that made the work extremely dangerous and physically punishing. Summer work brought different challenges, with extreme heat that could lead to fatal heat exhaustion combined with increased risks of disease outbreaks in the hot, unsanitary conditions of construction camps. For workers who managed to survive their conscription period, the return journey home was often as dangerous as the initial journey to construction sites. Workers who had been weakened by months of hard labor, inadequate nutrition, and exposure to harsh conditions frequently lacked the strength to complete the journey home. Some died within sight of their home villages after surviving the construction work itself. Even workers who successfully returned home often found that their experiences had fundamentally changed their lives and their relationships with their families and communities. The physical damage from months of heavy labor and poor conditions often left workers permanently disabled or in poor health. The psychological trauma of witnessing mass death and suffering, combined with their own experiences of extreme hardship, affected their ability to reintegrate into normal community life. The families of conscripted workers faced their own struggles during the extended absences. Women had to manage agricultural work and household responsibilities that had previously been shared with their husbands or sons. Children grew up without fathers during critical developmental periods. Elderly family members lost the care and support they had depended on from adult children. The economic impact on families was severe and long-lasting. The loss of adult male labor during critical agricultural periods often meant reduced crop yields and income. Families that had been economically stable before conscription often found themselves struggling to survive. The uncertainty about whether conscripted family members would return made it difficult to plan for the future or make necessary investments in agricultural or other economic activities. Communities, as a whole, were disrupted by the large-scale conscription of workers. Villages that lost significant portions of their adult male population had to reorganize their social and economic systems to function with reduced labor forces. Traditional community activities and institutions were disrupted when key participants were taken for construction work. The long-term effects on communities were substantial. Villages that had lost large numbers of workers to construction projects often never fully recovered their previous population levels. The social fabric of communities was permanently altered by the mass removal of workers and the high mortality rates among those who were conscripted, religious, and cultural. Responses to the massive mortality associated with wall construction varied, but often involved attempts to honor the dead and provide comfort to surviving families. Folk traditions developed around the spirits of workers who died in construction, and various ritual practices emerged to commemorate their sacrifice. These cultural responses helped communities process the traumatic losses they had experienced. The individual stories that occasionally surface in historical records provide glimpses into the human reality behind the construction statistics. Stories of workers who sacrificed their lives to save fellow workers, of families that waited years for news of conscripted relatives, of communities that came together to support families devastated by construction losses. These individual accounts help illustrate the human dimensions of what was primarily recorded as administrative and engineering achievement. The legacy of these individual experiences extends far beyond the construction period itself. The trauma experienced by construction workers and their families had effects that persisted through generations. The social and economic disruptions caused by mass conscription influenced community development patterns for decades after construction was completed. Understanding these individual experiences is essential to comprehending the true cost of Great Wall construction. The impressive engineering achievements and the strategic military benefits came at a price measured not just in resources and time, but in human lives and suffering on a scale that is difficult to comprehend from our modern perspective. Standing on the Great Wall today, surrounded by tourists taking photographs and marveling at the engineering achievement, it's both humbling and disturbing to realize that you're walking on what is literally the world's largest tomb. The stones beneath your feet, the mortar holding them together, the very earth that forms the wall's foundation, all of it is mixed with the remains of the hundreds of thousands of workers who died during its construction. The physical preservation of human remains within the wall structure wasn't accidental or ceremonial. It was a matter of practical necessity. Driven by the scale of mortality and the logistical challenges of construction in remote locations, confirms that bodies of dead workers were often buried directly in wall construction when proper burial became impractical. The sheer number of deaths, combined with the remote locations of construction sites and the pressure to maintain construction schedules, made individual burial impossible in many cases. Archaeological investigations of Great Wall sections have occasionally uncovered human remains that confirm these historical accounts. The discovery of skeletal remains within wall foundations and fill material provides stark physical evidence of the human cost of construction. These remains, found centuries after the original construction, serve as silent testimony to the workers, whose lives were literally built into the structure they were creating. The cultural impact of this massive loss of life extended far beyond the construction sites themselves. Chinese folk traditions developed elaborate all-stick mythologies around the Great Wall that reflected the traumatic experiences of construction. The story of Meng Zhongnu, whose tears were said to have caused a section of the wall to collapse when she came searching for her husband's body, became one of China's most enduring folk tales. These stories served not just as entertainment, but as cultural mechanisms for processing collective trauma and preserving memory of the human cost of imperial cures. Ambition. The demographic consequences of Great Wall construction had lasting effects on Chinese society that persisted for generations. The removal of hundreds of thousands of young men from the population affected marriage patterns, family structures, and community organization throughout northern China. Regions that had been heavily conscripted for construction workers experienced population declines that took decades to recover from, if they ever fully recovered at all. The economic legacy was equally profound and long-lasting. The massive reallocation of labor from productive economic activities to military construction disrupted agricultural production, craft industries, and trade relationships in ways that affected regional development for centuries. Areas that had been economically prosperous before wall construction sometimes never regained their previous levels of prosperity due to the disruption of their labor forces and economic systems. The technological legacy of Great Wall construction was more positive but came at an enormous human cost. The construction techniques, organizational systems, and engineering solutions developed during wall construction projects contributed to China's continued leadership in construction and engineering. Throughout its history, the knowledge gained through generations of wall construction was applied to other project cities, roads, canals, and buildings that benefited Chinese civilization for centuries. The administrative and organizational systems developed to manage hundreds of thousands of workers across vast construction projects contributed to the development of Chinese governmental and bureaucratic systems. The experience of coordinating massive construction projects helped develop the administrative capabilities that would allow Chinese governments to undertake other large-scale projects and manage complex, empire-wide activities. But these technological and administrative benefits were purchased with human suffering on a scale that is difficult to comprehend. The innovation and expertise that made Chinese engineering famous throughout the ancient world was developed through trial and error processes that cost hundreds of thousands of lives. Every improvement in construction technique, every organizational innovation, every engineering solution was learned through experiences that killed or injured the workers who participated in developing them. The preservation of the Great Wall itself has become a complex legacy issue that reflects changing attitudes toward the human cost of its construction. Modern conservation efforts focus on preserving the wall as an engineering and architectural achievement, but they also increasingly acknowledge the human sacrifice that its construction required. Memorial sites and interpretive materials now attempt to balance celebration of the engineering achievement with recognition of the human cost. The transformation of the Great Wall from military fortification to tourist attraction has created new layers of meaning and interpretation. Millions of people now visit the wall each year, drawn by its reputation as one of the wonders of the world. Most visitors are aware that the wall required enormous amounts of labor to construct, but few understand the scale of human suffering that was involved in its creation. The Great Wall status as a symbol of Chinese civilization and achievement creates ongoing tension between celebration of cultural accomplishment and acknowledgement of historical trauma. The wall represents both Chinese engineering capabilities and organizational prowess, and the human cost of imperial ambition and authoritarian power. This duality makes it a complex symbol that means different things to different people depending on which aspects of its history they choose to emphasize. Modern Chinese attitudes toward the Great Wall reflect this complexity. The wall is celebrated as a symbol of Chinese cultural achievement and national identity. But there is also growing recognition of the human cost of its construction. Educational materials and cultural discussions increasingly acknowledge the workers who died in its construction. Though this acknowledgement is often balanced with emphasis on the collective achievement and national benefit that resulted from their sacrifice, the international recognition of the Great Wall as a World Heritage Site has brought global attention to both its architectural significance and its human cost. International visitors and scholars have contributed to broader discussions about how to appropriately commemorate historical achievements that came at enormous human cost. These discussions have influenced how the wall is presented and interpreted for both domestic and international audiences. The ongoing maintenance and preservation of the Great Wall requires continuous work that echoes, in much smaller scale, the original construction challenges. Modern workers using contemporary tools and safety equipment continue the work of maintaining and repairing wall sections, carrying on the construction tradition under vastly improved working conditions. This ongoing work serves as a reminder that the wall remains a living structure that requires human labor to maintain its existence. The lessons learned from Great Wall construction about the human cost of massive public works projects have influenced how modern societies approach large-scale construction. The recognition that impressive engineering achievements can come with enormous human costs has contributed to the development of labor protection laws, safety regulations, and ethical standards for construction projects that aim to prevent the repetition of historical tragedies. The Great Wall stands today as a complex monument that simultaneously celebrates human achievement and commemorates human suffering. It represents the potential for human cooperation and organization to create lasting achievements, but also the potential for human societies to sacrifice individual welfare for collective goals. The wall embodies both the best and worst aspects of human civilization, our capacity for remarkable achievement, and our willingness to achieve those accomplishments through the expenditure of human lives. For the hundreds of thousands of workers whose remains are literally part of the wall. Structure: the Great Wall serves as their tomb, their monument, and their legacy. Their individual names and stories are lost to history, but their collective contribution to one of humanity's most recognizable achievements ensures that they will be remembered as long as the wall itself survives. In death, they became part of the very structure they gave their lives to create, ensuring that their sacrifice would be preserved for as long as the stones and mortars they worked with continue to stand against the forces of time and weather. The Great Wall of China, in all its complexity and contradictions, remains one of humanity's most powerful reminders that our greatest achievements often come at costs that are measured not just in resources and time, but in human lives and suffering. It challenges us to consider whether the benefits of such achievements justify their costs, and whether it's possible to accomplish great things without requiring such enormous sacrifices from the people to make them possible. As you drift toward sleep, consider this: the Great Wall of China that stretches across mountains and deserts, the wall that millions visit each year. The wall that has become a symbol of human achievement and endurance's wall exists because, over the course of more than 2 millennia, countless individuals made this simple daily choice to pick up their tools and continue working, even when the work was dangerous, exhausting, and seemingly endless. From the first workers in the Kingdom of Qi, pounding earth between wooden frames in 450 BC, to the Ming Dynasty craftsmen perfecting brick-making techniques in the 16th century AD, each contributed their small part to something that would outlast their own civilization. They couldn't see the grand scope of what they were creating. Their world was defined by the weight of the stones they carried, the rhythm of the rammers in their hands, the daily struggle to survive harsh conditions while building something that seemed to stretch on forever. The Great Wall stands today not just as a monument to imperial ambition or engineering prowess, but as a testament to the power of accumulated human effort. Every stone was placed by hand, every section built through the patient application of techniques refined through generations of trial and error. Every mile completed through the daily labor of people whose names are lost to history, but whose work endures in its quiet persistence across the Chinese landscape, weathered but unbroken after more than 2,000 years. The Great Wall reminds us that the most lasting human achievements are often built not through dramatic gestures or brilliant innovations, but through the steady accumulation of ordinary work performed by ordinary people who may never see the full significance of their contributions. The wall continues to stand, as it has for centuries, patiently waiting through each day and night. A stone record of human determination written across the landscape in a script that speaks of both our capacity for remarkable achievement and the price we sometimes pay to achieve it.